Alrighty, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Daphne. I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian, and my co-host today is Cindy Warwick, who many of you know is in charge of our Author Talk series. And our presenter today is Paul Soltis, and I will leave the proper introduction for Cindy. I just want to go over a few housekeeping items before we jump into the presentation. First and foremost, we will be taking your questions at the end of the program today, but you can submit them at any time using the questions box in the GoToWebinar dashboard. Okay. For those of you who might not be familiar with GoToWebinar, this is what your dashboard should look like if you're using a PC or a Mac. If you are using a mobile device, the dashboard is going to look a little bit different, but all of the features will still be there. In the center here, you have your audio section. You can check your audio there to make sure that it's connected to the right set of speakers. If you have any problems during the presentation, there is a raise hand button here that you can click. That'll alert me that you're having an issue, and then I will send you a message in GoToWebinar, and hopefully I'll be able to resolve that for you. As I mentioned, for questions, there is a questions box here. You can type in your question, hit send, and you can send them at any time, but we'll be taking questions at the end of the program today. So that is everything that I have for you. So I'm going to turn it over to Cindy for the introduction.
Well, I want to welcome everybody too. Thank you, Andrew. I hope everybody is staying safe and warm. And I want to thank you for joining with us today. Of course, I do my little ads first because I want to make you aware of some of the other things that we have available at the State Library. We have some great upcoming webinars. Tomorrow is Genealogy from Home, and that is with our genealogy librarian from the State Library, Regina Fitzpatrick. That's from noon to 1 p.m. Then on the 24th is Understanding Your Pension Benefits for State Employees. That's from 10 to 11:30 a.m. And on the 26th, it's Retirement Planning for PERS members. That's offered by Pensions and Benefits, but we're able to advertise it on our website and that. So that's on the 26th, and that is, I believe, from, I didn't put down the time, I think it's from 1 to 3:30, so it's something like that. And our next talk, which was just confirmed over the weekend, is on February 15th. It's called The Still Family Story. Its significance is relevant to the history of South Jersey. For anybody who's been in South Jersey and that, you've probably heard of Dr. James Still. There is a William Still, who I believe was an author in that. And so the Still family has been around for a long time in New Jersey and has had an impact on them. And so you might, that's February 15th. And I should have that up on the website either later today or tomorrow. But today's talk is entitled Hardenbergh Hikes Through History. I hope everybody has their hiking shoes on virtually, but you don't really have to do any walking today. We have Paul Soltis with us, who is the New Jersey State Park Services Resource Interpretive Specialist for Wallace House and the Old Dutch Parsonage historic sites. And he'll tell us a little bit about Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg. He was an artist and an ornithologist, and you're going to hear about the academic tradition of science and the natural philosophy at New Jersey's Colonial colleges that informed him, the ornithologist, and see the landscapes that were preserved at New Jersey state parks and forests today that inspired him. Paul holds a BA from William Mary and a certificate from the National Institute of American History and Democracy in Williamsburg, Virginia. And we had him last year, and he did a very interesting talk on suffrage, women's suffrage, and things that related to the Wallace House and the Old Dutch Parsonage. And I really enjoyed that talk, so I'm really looking forward to what you have for us today. Thanks, Paul.
All right, I think we're in. Welcome to our virtual Hardenbergh hike through history, art, and nature. I thought we would have a little bit more snow on the ground based on the weather forecast from last week, but we will still, it's still cold outside, but I love it that the cold is a great time to kind of think of some of these landscapes and natural places in New Jersey. And we're going to explore them through three areas. We're going to look at history, we're going to look at art, and we are going to look at nature through our study of the artist and ornithologist Gerard Rutgers-Hardenberg. Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg was an artist and ornithologist from New Brunswick. and sort of worked in New Jersey at the turn of the century, in the late 19th and into the early 20th centuries. Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg came to my attention because he was recently featured at Morven Museum and Garden in Princeton as a part of a featured exhibit in their changing exhibit galleries. Before he came to Morven, though, he was well known in Ocean County. And Patricia Burke, whose book I have pictured here, is really the historian from the Ocean County Cultural and Heritage Commission, who really in the first serious way kind of investigated Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg and has assembled together a history of the artist in this book, and has also worked with the collectors of Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg's artworks to put many of the artworks together. So what was at Morven Museum was really the first exhibition of his work since his death, and probably the collector thinks ever, because besides selling works out of his small New Brunswick gallery, even in his own lifetime, Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg didn't really put on major museum exhibitions. So it's a really neat opportunity to see art of New Jersey, and to see art of New Jersey sort of on the cusp of the major development and industry that was about to take place in the main part of the 20th century. So Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg, just because of the coincidence of the time in which he worked, kind of captured both wildlife and landscapes in New Jersey in that period. And why I was interested when I first heard of Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg is because, as Cindy mentioned, I'm the historian for the Old Dutch Parsonage State Historic Site in Somerville. Old Dutch Parsonage was the historic home of Dutch Reformed Church ministers, including the Reverend Jacob Rickers-Hardenberg, who was the founder and first president of Queens College. Queens College was later named, of course, renamed Rutgers for the Rutgers family of New York. And so for our first part of our hike today, we'll go through the history. We will explore the history, the family history behind this artist and ornithologist, Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg, and see his Jersey Dutch roots, both in New Jersey at the Old Dutch Parsonage through the Hardenbergh family, and in New York through the Rutgers family. The Old Dutch Parsonage is a state historic site in Somerville, and you can see it's the brick structure there on the right. I chose this angle because we're talking about interest in nature, so some of the more natural scenery around the house today. And the Old Dutch Parsonage, as the name suggests, served as a residence for ministers of the Dutch Reformed Church. New Jersey was, before it became an English colony, was of course a Dutch colony, part of the larger colony of New Netherland, which encompassed both New Jersey and New York, and even extended at some points into eastern Pennsylvania and into Delaware, so primarily based around the waterways, what we call the Hudson River and the Delaware River. In 1664, the English took New Netherland from the Dutch and split it into two, and thus we have New York and New Jersey, but the Dutch didn't leave, and the Dutch people, the Dutch colonists, remained a vital part of New Jersey's cultural, civic, and social life, and as well as its ecclesial and church life. And so in this part of New Jersey, the Dutch Reformed Church was a major denomination, even in 1751, nearly 100 years after the English takeover. So in 1751, several congregations of the Dutch Reformed Church along the Raritan River joined up together to build this house for their shared minister. The first minister to reside here was the Reverend Johannes Frelinghuysen, but before he could become a full minister, he had to travel to Amsterdam to obtain his license to preach in the Dutch Reformed Church. The Dutch Reformed Church in America was still governed from the established Dutch Reformed Church in the Netherlands. And it was as a result of that journey to Amsterdam that he met and married Dina van Berg, who would be the great-great-grandmother of our artist and ornithologist, Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg. Dina van Berg was born in the Netherlands. We know actually quite a bit about her early life there because she kept a diary when she was about late teens, early 20s. And that diary survives today in the special collections at Rutgers and at the New Brunswick Theological Seminary. and it offers some great direct insight into her personality, especially her religious views. It's primarily a spiritual diary, and Dina van Berg was a pietist, part of a movement that emphasized a very strict adherence to the Calvinist principles of the Dutch Reformed Church, and really also emphasized an individual and personal relationship with God. And the pietist movement in Europe is kind of similar to the Great Awakening movement, as it was called in America. And so there was definitely a shared energy between Dina van Berg and this minister from New Jersey, Johannes Frelinghuysen. Dina van Berg, however, did not immediately accept the proposal of marriage from Johannes Frelinghuysen. It would mean not only marriage to a minister's wife, but emigration, leaving behind her whole life in the Netherlands for a totally new and uncertain life in a foreign colony across the sea. But according, as we can see in her diary, she eventually comes around to this idea of marrying and moving, not so much out of any devotion to Reverend Frelinghuysen himself, I think, but really her devotion to God. She sees this as an opportunity for herself to answer a call from God, and reflects on the idea of going to a foreign land and speaking among people of a foreign tongue that's kind of contained in the scriptures that she read so closely. And so Dina van Berg accepts the idea and moves to New Jersey and moves into the Old Dutch Parsonage. What we have here is in the picture is actually a photograph of Dina van Berg's dress, a piece of her clothing that also survives in the university archives and special collections at Rutgers, which is really rare to be able to have a piece of clothing that we know has direct provenance from a particular woman. It's an interesting dress because for all her severity, all her wishes against dancing, her strictures against kind of singing profane hymns, she was happy to sing, I should say, singing secular songs. She was happy to sing hymns, but she felt that people were too distracted with kind of the popular music of the day. She wears a gown that, if not over the top, is kind of its era. You know, she allows some floral decoration, and this would probably be the most formal dress that she wore as a minister's wife in New Jersey. And of course, she brings in a floral decoration, inadvertently, kind of foreshadowing the interests generations later that her great-great-grandson would take in sort of the natural world too. When the Frelinghuysen's arrived in New Jersey, they invited students, young men, to train at the house to become Dutch Reformed Church ministers. And that is how the artist great-great-grandfather, Reverend Jacob Hardenbergh, arrives on the scene. Reverend Hardenbergh was born in New York to a very wealthy and prominent Dutch family in that region, and he journeyed first to New Jersey as a student, preparing for ministry in the church as a kind of protege of Reverend Frelinghuysen, and with a handful of other young men would live in the house and board and study there. After Reverend Frelinghuysen's early death, he died in 1754, so only about 4 years that the Frelinghuysen's are married and that the students are living and studying with them. Dina van Berg considered very closely a return home to the Netherlands. She had no reason to remain now without her husband. But in an interesting letter during that period, she mentions to one of her correspondents that she sends the regards of the students as well. 8 months after the death of her husband, the students, including the future Reverend Hardenbergh, were apparently still living in the house. Is that an indication that Dina van Berg, who we know from her diary was so well read in scripture and so interested in the theology of the church, was she in any way involved in their religious formation and maybe kind of carrying it on even after her husband's death? Or was she simply, the housekeeper who was providing them room and board as they sorted out what their next steps would be? I have to be careful. That little scrap of evidence is not enough to make a conclusion, but it's an interesting scrap of evidence to consider as we try to figure out the lives of these people in the past, especially when unfortunately we don't have as much information as we would like on them. Dina van Berg, though, would not leave New Jersey. She would actually stay in the Old Dutch Parsonage. Whoops, excuse me, make sure that I think the screen share should be back now. Dina van Berg would not leave the Old Dutch Parsonage, she would remain on because eventually Jacob Hardenbergh would take over as the new minister, succeeding his former teacher, and he proposed marriage to his old teacher's wife. So she'd been doing a pretty good job as minister's wife. Why not keep her on board? And so Reverend Hardenbergh and Dina Van Berg married. And this now would be the union that launches the Hardenbergh family in New Jersey. And that would later lead to the artist and ornithologist Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg a few generations later. Jacob Hardenbergh led the effort to not just have a small seminary in his own home, but to actually establish a college for the Dutch in New Jersey. And in 1766, he secured a charter for Queen's College, which through the years would become Rutgers. After the Revolutionary War, he also became the first full president of Rutgers, of Queen's College, serving in that role from 1785 till his death in 1790. And even after his death, Dina Van Berg remains on as a supporter of the college in New Brunswick. She writes a letter trying to help recruit a second president to succeed her late husband. Perhaps another indication that she saw this college not just as her husband's project, but really as her own. Much like decades earlier in her life, she saw this ministry in New Jersey as not just her husband's ministry, but a way for her to fulfill a call from God herself. As we explore the Hardenbergh family, we do find a connection through the grim bonds of slavery to Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was born into slavery, in effect, on the same plantation into which Jacob Hardenbergh was born into freedom. Sojourner Truth's first slaveholders were the brother and then later the nephew of Jacob Hardenbergh, our Hardenbergh at the Old Dutch Parsonage. And Sojourner Truth is an interesting figure in that she is kind of a well-known name who represents many more lesser-known or unknown names of the African Dutch culture that emerged in Ulster County and in these heavily Dutch regions of New York and New Jersey, combining the Christianity and the language even of, and sometimes in cases the food, the religious holidays and customs of the Dutch around them with their own traditions and their own perspectives as African New Yorkers, African New Jerseyans, African Americans. Sojourner Truth's first name at birth was Isabella, often called Isabella Boomfree. Her father was called Boomfree. His name was a Dutch word for a strong, sturdy tree. And Sojourner Truth eventually gained her freedom and took this name, Sojourner Truth, and combined both religious preaching and political oratory in her work as an activist against slavery and in favor of women's suffrage. Sojourner Truth spoke Dutch as her first language. So really all that later career as a speaker, she's speaking her second language and probably carried a Dutch rhetorical tilt to her speaking. This gives us the paternal family of the artist Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg. But he also combines in his bloodline the family for whom the college was later renamed. The artist's mother was herself Cornelia Rutgers. She was not a direct descendant of Colonel Henry Rutgers, but a sort of descendant of a cousin of Henry Rutgers. So although he is not a direct descendant, he is part of the larger family. Colonel Henry Rutgers was a New Yorker, not a New Jerseyan, but he was Dutch, and to the Dutch, that kind of border was an English border. So there's a lot of interplay across that line. He comes from a wealthy family in and outside New York, and during the American Revolutionary War served in the New York militia and was an important quartermaster working with supply chains and all that. And so it's from that service that he attains his military rank as a colonel. Colonel Henry Rutgers attended college not at Queen's, but at King's, the Anglican college in New York that would later be renamed Columbia. And after the Revolutionary War, Colonel Rutgers was a prominent philanthropist for Dutch Reformed religious causes and educational causes as well. He was, for a time, a trustee at Queen's College. He was also a trustee at the College of New Jersey. So Rutgers College was not his exclusive cause. And in 1825, the incoming Queen's College president proposed to the Board of Trustees that Queen's College ought to be renamed for this Dutch Reformed philanthropist, Colonel Henry Rutgers. Henry Rutgers, the hope was that they would immediately give a new name to the college that kind of reflects their own Dutch American history and heritage. They're giving up the old name Queen's, named for Queen Charlotte, the reigning British monarch at the time the college was chartered. And also, on a practical level, they might entice a financial donation if they give this well-known and wealthy philanthropist the honor of renaming the college in his name. And so in 1825, the legislature approved of this change, and Queen's College was officially redesignated as Rutgers College. Colonel Rutgers was grateful for the honor, although he had not asked for it. He did provide funds to purchase a bell for Rutgers College, and that bell is the same bell that still sits in the cupola of Old Queen's today, the oldest structure purpose-built for Rutgers College, and of course is the anchor of the historic campus in New Brunswick. He also provided a small bond to the Dutch Reformed Church to help basically pay for scholarships for students to go to Rutgers College. But unfortunately, at the time of his death, although his will laid out many generous gifts to several charitable causes, Rutgers College was not among them, to the disappointment of the Rutgers trustees. Nonetheless, of course, that name has stuck and has remained with Rutgers as it grew from a college into the State University of New Jersey. This is an interesting period of naming and renaming. Obviously, Colonel Rutgers' own alma mater, King's College, in their effort to become a more American institution, gave up the name King's in favor of Columbia, centering themselves in the Western Hemisphere. I'm from here, just outside Trenton, Lawrence Township in New Jersey, which at the time of the Revolution was Maidenhead, named for a town near Windsor Castle in England, and after the War of 1812 was renamed for James Lawrence, the captain who proclaimed, "Don't give up the ship." So some of the renaming takes place during the Revolutionary War, after the Revolution, but really the big wave is after the War of 1812, this second war between the United States and Great Britain. Interestingly, of course, Colonel Henry Rutgers himself has now been a question of naming and renaming in more recent years. Colonel Rutgers was a slaveholder, as were so many of the wealthy and prominent Dutch Americans of this age. And questions are important and interesting to ask about what does the naming and renaming of a place mean to the institutions that it represents. Obviously, in 1825, it's not a new question, at least. In 1825, the Rutgers trustees had the same question. Does it make sense for us to bear the name of a queen with whom we really don't have any meaningful connection, or should we take on a new name there? One of the proposal names of someone who could be honored in Colonel Rutgers' place is Paul Robeson, the Rutgers graduate of the early 1900s. Interestingly, we have an incidental connection to the Old Dutch Parsonage. Paul Robeson was our neighbor in Somerville, and of course would go on to study at Rutgers, the college that was founded from our parsonage. He himself lived in a parsonage, but not a Dutch parsonage. Paul Robeson's father was the minister of the St. Thomas AME Church in Somerville and was born in Princeton, but moved to Somerville when his father's ministry relocated there. In addition, of course, as the sign here from downtown Somerville points out, was not just a graduate of Rutgers, but a graduate of Somerville High School too. So I don't have the answers here today, but it is interesting at least to put these conversations in their long context, that it's certainly not a new subject, and it's not one that's going away. How do we choose the different people, the different symbols that give meaning to who we are today in the present as communities and as people? We're talking about art and artists, so of course we're going to talk about art. And so for the second part of our hike, we're going to take a walk through the artistic tradition that informed the artist and ornithologist Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg. Hardenberg's work focuses on the wildlife of the New Jersey shore, and in particular the birds of the New Jersey shore, and has gotten comparisons, of course, most immediately to the most famous bird artist in American history, John James Audubon. Audubon, I will point out, has his own New Jersey connections. Although he was not a New Jerseyan, he certainly worked and studied in New Jersey, studying in the field in New Jersey. For a time in 1829, he actually took up a longer-term residence on Cooper Street in Camden in New Jersey. And of course, in Camden County today is the borough of Audubon, named in honor of his work in that greater region. John James Audubon, in I think at least on 2 occasions, went out to Great Egg Harbor, which was an excellent source for birds. The name Great Egg Harbor comes from the eggs that the Dutch saw there, the first Dutch ships sailing in the early 1600s in that region, because it was such an important and critical location for migratory birds. And increasingly today, we're trying to help protect those birds and bring back those great eggs to Great Egg Harbor and other spots along the Jersey Shore. We'll talk about that in our 3rd section of our program. And John James Audubon also worked at a location called Mickel Swamp. Now, Mickel Swamp is not on a map of any map of New Jersey today, but one of the curators at the New Jersey State Museum has located Mickel Swamp in history. It was kind of an open area south of Camden, but north of Gloucester City. And at the time Audubon was in New Jersey, it was an open swamp, now kind of developed over. But New Jersey, then, as it remains to this day, was of course a great rich place to find some of these rare species of birds. And Audubon certainly identified that even before Hardenbergh's era. One of the collectors who really gave a lot of the artworks to Morven for the exhibition, though, he has pointed out that in his view, yes, you can see a lot of similarities at first between Audubon and Hardenbergh, but when you start to dig deeper, you'll notice the difference. Audubon is kind of a more scientific, more technical approach to the wildlife, whereas Hardenbergh is more strictly interested as an artist in kind of the beauty and impressions of them. You can make those decisions for yourself. Those are kind of the artistic interpretations, but that's the kind of the most immediate predecessor to Hardenbergh was the famous Audubon. But he has predecessors going back into the 18th century as well. Mark Catesby was an English naturalist who visited America, really more, not quite New Jersey, but Virginia and the Carolinas in the early 1700s. His sister moved to Williamsburg, Virginia, when she married an American colonist. And Catesby traveled along to visit her on one occasion and extended his stay for years because he was so captivated by the wildlife, not only birds, but especially birds, but also other creatures and other plants that were unique to the American continent. And you can see in Mark Catesby's work a lot of resemblance to Audubon. And in fact, Audubon, in an era where intellectual property was not understood the same way, so he wasn't necessarily plagiarizing, but would take some of Catesby's drawings and include them in his works, kind of building on this intellectual tradition of studying birds and animals in the field. Catesby would later return to England, and his paintings, his drawings, and his artworks became kind of great indications of what the different wildlife was that was present in this totally new continent, at least from the English perspective. In terms of what this field looked like in the 18th century, at the time we talk about the Old Dutch Parsonage, colleges explored a subject called natural philosophy. So we're not quite yet in the era of biology, but natural philosophy has emerged in the Enlightenment. Natural philosophy sort of refers to understanding the natural world, but maybe more in your head than actually out in the field. It's moving away from the theology that initially, in the Middle Ages especially, was used to explain all the world. In the Enlightenment, they're now kind of saying, okay, we can understand the world on its own terms, not denying God, but without necessarily using God as the explanation for natural causes. But in that sense, it really resembles more physics, sort of think about what could cause certain things to move. But it is also interested in the geology and in the plants and wildlife that inhabits an area. I'm using this picture to show another colonial college. This is the Bodleian Plate, which depicts the College of William and Mary on the top in Virginia. It also depicts below it images of, on the left, the Capitol, at the center, the College of William and Mary from the back, and on the right, the Governor's Palace. And this plate was discovered at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, sort of just in the nick of time, just as the Williamsburg restoration that would really reconstruct the colonial city of Williamsburg was underway under the with the support of Rockefeller in the 1930s. And so this kind of part of the Bodleian Plate, for those who are interested in history museums, is pretty famous, as it informed the reconstruction of several buildings at Colonial Williamsburg. But what's less familiar is this kind of third bit of it. And this is the third segment of the Bodleian Plate. And it depicts not only buildings, but it extends that depiction to include nature. And you see, again, some of these spiders, plants, flowers, bugs, even a seahorse as part of that depiction. So very early on, colonists were interested in the natural world of America. It also depicts, as you'll see on the far left and the far right, American Indian figures, in this case, Powhatan Indians of Virginia. And important to recognize that in the reality of colonization, these people so often and too often were viewed not as fellow humans, fellow men to collaborate with in a shared endeavor, but as naturals, they'd be called often in the language of the time. They're sort of just part and parcel of the animals and wildlife around them, and would lead, of course, to so many painful relations between American colonists and American Indians throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. An interesting indication, too, to remember that this is not just studying nature for nature's sake. It is studying nature in the context of colonization, studying it to understand what are the resources there, how can we understand them, and how can we conquer them. Very much in line with the ethos that informed the colonial colleges. The colonial colleges were not only places to learn for the sake of learning, but were places to expand the colonial administration of these American territories. So learning and politics, education and conquest, are closely intertwined as we try to understand the motives and interests of these periods. Nonetheless, for us today, these kinds of clues give us great insight into, when we understand them for who made them and what they are, give us some great insight into the people and places and natural world of this time. That gives you an introduction to what the study of nature was or wasn't in the 18th century. But what was it by the time the artist, Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg, came on the scene? And in his time, New Jersey's two colonial colleges were still in operation. We depict the College of New Jersey there on the left, later renamed Princeton University, and of course Queens College on the right, renamed even before the time of Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg's birth, Rutgers College. Although he was born in New Brunswick, and his name is Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg, when he began collecting birds and bird species, he did all this work in collaboration with the biology department, not at Rutgers, but at Princeton. What's going on there? Well, what happens is Gerard Hardenbergh really discovers the Jersey Shore, visiting these different kind of outdoor clubs that used to dot the coast there, gun and rod clubs, really kind of outdoorsmen's lodges. And so definitely they were interested in the outdoors and the wildlife, but definitely interested in conservation from the perspective of conserving what's here so that we can continue to hunt it. And in addition to painting the wildlife, Hardenbergh was also a hunter, and he would collect the specimens that he captured and basically send them back to the biology department at Princeton to serve as specimens of study. And only a handful are still in the biology collection at Princeton with tags marking them as specimens caught by Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg. Now, why, if this is a New Brunswick guy named Rutgers-Hardenberg, did he do it at Princeton? Well, best explanation I've found is that's really where he found a member of the faculty who was kind of interested in this. Remember, we saw natural philosophy is not quite biology. This is the era where biology as a field study is emerging, actually studying the anatomy of specimens themselves. And so at Princeton, he actually found a professor who was kind of interested in this emerging field. And that's why, although he is a New Brunswick figure, he would send his specimens off to the biology department there. And although Princeton only has a few specimens that are labeled as Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg's, they were not very detailed with their record keeping in this period. So it's very likely that there are many, many more, some that are probably still in the biology department at Princeton, and others that could be all over the country. Another part of this early field biology was trading specimens. So any professors gathering at a conference or symposium might bring some of their own birds that they have a handful of, and trade them off for birds or other specimens that are rarer in their areas. So they could be dispersed through the collections of colleges and universities across the United States today. But although he was an ornithologist in the sense that he captured and studied the birds, it was really as an artist that Gerard Hardenbergh made his mark. And that'll bring us on to our third part of our hike. We've gone through history, we've gone through the art, or at least the artistic tradition, and now we're going to look at the nature. When Morven Museum presented this exhibition, they really presented it, as I mentioned earlier, as a fascinating opportunity to see New Jersey just before the massive development of not only the shore, but of course the state at large. And parts of the areas Gerard Hardenbergh depicted, you cannot see anymore. Because of parts of Barnegat Bay that were canaled, saltwater and freshwater now meet, and so different plant species have kind of emerged and taken over those areas. Other parts, of course, have been developed with homes and with other kind of construction. And the idea of the art exhibit was that really this is kind of a lost world. You're able to see through this artist parts of New Jersey that are gone. And that is definitely an important and interesting premise. And I'm not going to reject it outright, but I would like to suggest that although obviously radically transformed, it's not gone altogether. And we'll kind of see places where if you know where to go and where to look, you can still find landscapes that, if not the exact same as the landscapes this artist depicted, are very similar, still in their feel and in their wildlife too. The Barnegat Bay was the primary area of artist inspiration for Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg. Although he was born and lived in New Brunswick and had a studio there where he would exhibit his works, he really also lived in Bay Head at the top of the Barnegat Bay. And for a large part of his life, he had a houseboat called the Pelican, on which he would sail up and down the bay and depict the landscape and the wildlife. Interestingly, the Barnegat Bay itself has Jersey Dutch, we might say, roots, at least in its name. The name Barnegat Bay comes from a Dutch word, Barandagat, which kind of translates as the place of the breakers, or more idiomatically, kind of the place of swelling and turning around and around. And that name was given by the early Dutch explorers. Henry Hudson led the Half Moon, the Hive Mine, as a Dutch ship along the New Jersey coast on his voyages in 1609, and he was the first European to really identify and map out the area we call today the Jersey Shore. He was looking for the Northwest Passage. He kind of entered the Delaware Bay, and the water was just too rough there, and he said, "This cannot be a path to the Northwest. This is not going to take us. It's too rough." And so after that, he traveled along the Jersey Shore. And it would have been in that generation that they gave this name Barandagat to this area because the water was so rough and fierce, contained in these bays. Later, even by the 18th century, the name kind of was corrupted and eventually became Barnegat. So Barnegat is an old name. It appears on maps as early as the Revolutionary War, but its even earlier name probably comes from this Dutch word Barandagat. I don't know if Gerard Hardenbergh knew this. I don't know if he ever thought about it, but for us, it's kind of an interesting thing to reflect on the long history of these Dutch and then later Dutch Americans in this area. The New Jersey State Park Service administers two major state parks on the Barnegat Bay today. Of course, the most famous is Island Beach State Park. And here we have an aerial view of Island Beach State Park. And the Atlantic Ocean is on the left from this view with the flat, straight sandy beach. And on the right is the Barnegat Bay, and on the other side, this Island Beach State Park preserves what we call the Barrier Island between the mainland New Jersey and the open Atlantic Ocean. And Island Beach is famous and well attended and well visited because of its great swimming areas, and rightly so. Beautiful bathing areas on the Atlantic Ocean side, where you can, in the summer, swim in the ocean, but also fish and walk along the beach all up and down, nearly 9 miles. But on the right-hand side is a lesser-known part of Island Beach State Park, and that is the Bayside kind of network of walking trails. Island Beach is really kind of one of the only extensive preserved spots along the Jersey Shore, where you see the Jersey Shore in its kind of natural environment and natural ecosystem. So it's a real treasure that we still have at least one portion of our Jersey Shore preserved in its natural state. And so you see the really unique, first of all, plants that grow there. They have to be pretty tough plants to be able to grow and live along the Atlantic Ocean, where you get constant storms, constant wind, constant salt in the air, and also the soil itself is pretty sandy soil. But there's some beautiful plants that grow and thrive in this environment. And because of the unique plant life here, it supports a very unique wildlife, and that includes birds, the osprey and other species of birds that nest in this area. New Jersey is an important migratory bird haven. So what I mean by that is there are many species of birds that basically travel up and down the whole of the hemisphere, from the Arctic regions to the tropical and equatorial regions of the Western Hemisphere. And they will stop in New Jersey, is a place to nest, as a place to lay eggs, and also as a place to kind of eat up and refuel as they're making their seasonal journeys between these two remote extreme areas. And so we have the great benefit that since they stop here, they become our neighbors, at least for a time, and we can go out and see some of these birds. And these are views of Island Beach State Park, an osprey nest on the left, and a bird watching area on the right, which you might not think of when you think of the Jersey Shore, but this is all part of the experience of the Jersey Shore too. And what's also great about these trails is you get real natural really quick. So it's not like you have to go real long or far away into a mountain or on a long hike. Most of these trails are less than a mile, but just a few yards in and you already feel you're completely removed. You can't believe that you were just at the beach or that you were just on the boardwalk or near the ice cream and the Ferris wheel. It's a totally separate place. So it gives high reward for a very quick or very brief walk. Just make sure you're prepared for mud. On the opposite side, at the southern tip of Island Beach State Park, is the jetty, the opening of water, and that opens up to the northern tip of Long Beach Island. And at the very northern tip of Long Beach Island is Barnegat Lighthouse State Park. The Barnegat Lighthouse State Park, of course, preserves Old Barney, the historic lighthouse at the northern end of the island, which is a great historic site you can visit, and includes some great historical interpretation of that lighthouse. But for the purposes of our kind of natural exploration, Barnegat Lighthouse State Park also preserves this excellent patch of open beach at the very northern tip of Long Beach Island, right? Itself a very heavily developed and populated island resort community. And increasingly, our New Jersey Division of Fish and Wildlife is working with Rutgers and with other partners to make sure that Barnegat Lighthouse State Park can serve as a nesting ground for a bird species called the piping plover. And so with these kind of tidal pools inside, during certain seasons of the year, the Division of Fish and Wildlife will rope off portions of the park, ask visitors not to enter so that the plover have place to nest and then to feed before they grow strong enough to then fly off and then come back in the next generation to again lay and nest their eggs right here in the Garden State. So that's really exciting work, and interesting, of course, that it's done with that university that bears that name, Rutgers. That long history coming through there. And Barnegat Lighthouse also does have a small, what they call maritime habitat trail as well. So after you visit the lighthouse, you can take a little walk and also see some of the rare plant species that can only survive and thrive in these kind of interesting environments where the salt and the hurricanes and the storms are all kind of whipping around them. But certain species of plants and trees survive there. And with that kind of as your introduction to the history, your introduction to the art, and your introduction to the nature that informed Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg, I invite you to take your own Hardenbergh hike. Of course, if you come up and visit me at Old Dutch Parsonage State Historic Site, #1 on the map here in Somerville, we interpret and preserve the long history of the Hardenbergh family and Rutgers College, both their origins in the colonial period and in the Revolutionary War, but also that long history through its growth as the land-grant college and then eventually as the State University of New Jersey. #2, Morven Museum in Garden in Princeton hosted the exhibition of the artworks of Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg. Unfortunately, that exhibition is now closed, but there's an excellent book, the book I showed you earlier from Patricia Burke, which you can reach out to Morven Museum for more information about. And in that book, at least you can explore and see some of the actual artworks. So I've kind of talked all around the artist himself today, kind of give you the context now in which to really explore the artist and his art himself. But there's another exhibition on a related topic that is still on. It'll be on until March of this year, 2022. And it's just a little bit farther down at #3 in our capital at Trenton, next door to the State Library. The New Jersey State Museum has an exhibition on called Fine Feathered Friends, Birds as Mainstay and Muse. And while it's not about Gerard Hardenbergh in particular, it explores the wider legacy of birds in art, in science, and in fashion, and in life. And so you can check out that exhibit, still on now at the New Jersey State Museum. And since it's a bird exhibit in New Jersey's capital, of course, it has some of the excellent birds, porcelain that came out of the beam factories of Trenton Makes, the World Takes fame. There's a bird there. There's also a sculpture of birds made in Trenton at the Vatican Museums, were a gift to the Pope. So they're all around the world, but you can see them right here at your state museum. And then further afield to get on nature, move down to #4. As I mentioned, Island Beach and Bargate Lighthouse State Parks offer those trails. And even during the winter, they're great to visit. In fact, I'd recommend them in the winter because you don't have the crowds that are on the bathing beaches. So you have really full run at the place. And bundle up, take a nice little brisk hike out there and check out some of those coastal areas and get a sense of the landscape and wildlife that inspired Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg, and of the work that we as New Jersey today, at Department of Environmental Protection, and as residents and citizens have to kind of protect and continue to maintain those works, so that although we have these beautiful paintings, we can also see them in a living ecosystem too. I'm at Wallace House in Old Dutch Parsonage, State Historic Sites, and I thank you so much for joining the State Library today for this conversation.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul. We'll be doing our Q&A session now. So if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to submit them using the questions box in the dashboard. And we'll be happy to answer them for you. All right. First question. Are the buildings in the drawings still standing in Princeton University and at Rutgers University?
Sure. Do I still have my screen shared?
No, but you should be able.
Oops. Might as well put them on. No one can see your screen. Hold on.
There you go.
Just so we have them while I'm talking about it. Okay. Whoops. There we are. New Jersey's Colonial Colleges. Yes. So on the left, these are, I like to use early depictions, but actually, yeah, all three of these buildings are still standing. So on the left is the College of New Jersey, the original name given to Princeton University. It began also as a parsonage school, really, but not a Dutch parsonage, a Presbyterian parsonage, primarily Scots Presbyterians in New Jersey in this period. The first president was the minister in Elizabethtown, it was called back then. And so the college operated out of his minister's residence, his parsonage. The second president was the minister in Newark, and so the college operated out of his parsonage during that period. That's when Richard Stockton, for example, later the signer of the Declaration of Independence. He's a graduate of Princeton, but he never studied at Nassau Hall. He studied out of a parsonage in Newark. And then by 1766, so about 10 years after they had, or 1756, excuse me, 10 years after the charter for the College of New Jersey, they finally settled on Princeton as their permanent seat. And they set about the process of constructing a building. And this is an 18th century view of Nassau Hall. And so the large building there at the center is Nassau Hall, and that is the same Nassau Hall that stands at Princeton University today. Although it is not exactly the same in appearance. It did endure fires later in the 19th century. And so when reconstructed, although a lot of the stone was preserved, the cupola is much larger and the building itself has fewer stories. So it's not exactly what Nassau Hall looks like today, but this is the view of Nassau Hall as it appeared at the time of the American Revolution, for sure. The Nassau Hall that, say, James Madison, later President of the United States, saw during his studies there. To the right is the president's house. This house was constructed to accommodate the president of the College of New Jersey, and it still stands today too, although it is called McLean House, and it is today the Alumni Association, I think, for Princeton University is headquartered at what was formerly the president's house. They do have another president's residence. Later, the presidents would live at Prospect. Woodrow Wilson most famously lived there, but then the presidents have another house today. I don't know what it is. But on the right is Queens College, and that building survives today too, and that is called Old Queens. Now, Queens College, this building was built after the Revolutionary War. It was built in the 1810s, but it was the first purpose-built building for the college. So when they started lessons in 1771, they operated out of a tavern in New Brunswick, and they kind of used buildings around New Brunswick until by the 1810s, they were really large enough that, yeah, okay, we've got enough people, we've got enough resources, we can actually build our own college building. And so from 1809 till about 1821, I think, they constructed this building that you see here. And now this is the College Avenue campus of Rutgers, New Brunswick. So this building remains, but is now kind of just the anchor of a much larger New Brunswick campus for Rutgers University. But the bell that Colonel Rutgers donated is still up there in the cupola of Old Queens. So that's the buildings that we see pictured here.
What was your most intriguing research part of this whole project?
Oh, sure. Well, I would say I've got to give a lot of credit. I'll bring up that book by Patricia Burke, who's retired now from the Ocean County Cultural and Heritage Commission, who really put together, before Morven put together the exhibit, she did kind of the groundwork, working with the private collector who's collected a lot of this artist's work and put it together in an exhibition. And so I guess, yeah, someone who works out of the Old Dutch Parsonage, I was interested in the family history. But I suppose really what was most interesting to me was that whole Princeton thing, because I kept asking that. I was like, how could it be that, you know, Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg, you can't get any more Rutgers than that, that he gave, he did all his actual academic work with Princeton. What's going on there? I love kind of following the interplay. So obviously most of my work I do is around the 18th century connections between Rutgers and Princeton, but I think it's cool to kind of follow them through up to the present. You know, one becoming the state university and one becoming the Ivy League, and the roles that they've played in New Jersey life since that time. I myself, I'm a graduate, I'm from New Jersey, but I'm a graduate of William and Mary, which I think is kind of cool because that is the other colonial college like Rutgers that is not in the Ivy League, but instead became a public university in its respective state. William and Mary today, a public university of Virginia, and Rutgers today, a public university of New Jersey. So yeah, kind of exploring, that was really interesting to me, was to figure out why was he doing this all with Princeton? And you know, I've given you what I've discovered so far, which is most of that explanation about the professor, but yeah, I definitely want to study more and further into that question.
All right.
And what's neat about these exhibitions, of course, was the exhibition that prompted my initial research on this topic. But hey, history is always interesting, so we can always continue to pursue it even now that the exhibition has closed.
Do you know if there are any historical markers related to him?
That's a great question, and I don't know that for sure. If there are any, they'd probably be in Ocean County. He lived in Bay Head. Probably the Patricia Burke book would have the answers maybe to some of these questions. If his house survives, I don't know if I think he lived in a few different places, but later in life he kind of started to I guess got too old for a houseboat, so he actually bought like a full-time residence in Bay Head, and that might still be around. From just trying to remember off the top of my head, and I'll admit, this is a little bit outside my usual realm of interpretation, but it's a great excuse for me to explore another period of New Jersey history than I usually do. So I don't know off the top of my head if there are markers, but if there are any, they'd probably be Ocean County Cultural and Heritage Commission's work to really study and sort of bring this artistic figure to the fore. If you're interested, of course, I mentioned his artworks. The exhibition that was on at Morven was all assembled. So Morven Museum does not own any of those works. And the vast majority of the works in the exhibition, and also the works that are depicted in this book, if you look at the book, are in the ownership of a private collector. He is a New Jerseyan and grew up in Bay Head, and I had the chance to take a tour of the museum exhibit with him when it was on at Morven, and he was really interesting to hear him talk about how he got interested in it. He did not know Hardenbergh himself. He died, in like the 1920s, Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg, but he did know people who knew him. And so his first encounter was really at the ground level, finding this guy's artworks at Ocean County, yard sales, or still in people's houses who had gotten them from the artist directly. And apparently Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg would like give them out sort of as payment or in lieu of payment. If someone was helping him do a repair on his boat, instead of paying with money, he'd offer a painting. And so that's how they kind of got into the homes of local areas. So although they're not quite yet in like a single museum collection, this artist is kind of collecting them privately, but he really wants to at least keep them in the ownership of a New Jerseyan, and then where they go from there, only the future will show. But that's kind of the background to where the artworks themselves are. And Hardenbergh, it seems he really was, he painted New Jersey. People have asked, well, did he ever do like the grand tour or anything? And from what I've learned, he took like a trip down to the Carolinas at one point in his life. But no, he was really content and happy to live and work and paint along the Jersey Shore and in New Brunswick. That was really his area of subject. So he's not only a New Jersey artist in that he's a New Jerseyan, but he's a New Jersey artist in his subject and focus too.
I've never heard of Hardenbergh before. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, and I never did either. So I don't know, part of it, I guess, is because he, like we said, he didn't, it seems he was more maybe like a gentleman artist, although it was his profession. They say like if you, and again, I'm really indebted to the work of Patricia Burke here, who really did this historical digging in the records. But if you like his census records, where he appears on censuses, he listed his occupation as artist, so he understood that as his profession. But yeah, he wasn't necessarily. I don't think he was. He wasn't necessarily widely published or printing his work or sharing it in his own lifetime, very far beyond the immediate neighborhoods and regions in which he worked. The Hardenbergh family they became kind of cultural. One of his cousins was Henry Janeway Hardenbergh, who was an architect. And Henry Janeway Hardenbergh was architect for several New York City landmarks, including the Plaza Hotel. He was also architect for several projects at Rutgers, including the Kirkpatrick Chapel. So his family was artistic and kind of involved in these different kind of cultural pursuits. But yeah, I guess a combination that he didn't really sell or print or publish in his own life, and so he kind of remained a pretty niche figure. He was known in the Barnegat Bay area and Bay Head, but really not much farther beyond that. And so I only found about it because of this exhibition, as I give full credit. I love all the different exhibits they put on at Morven, but then when I first saw advertised, our next exhibit is someone called Gerard Rickers-Hardenberg, and I just thought, what? That's got to have something to do with my Old Dutch Parsonage. And interestingly, the collector, Tom Van Nostrand, who's really is the major collector of Hardenbergh works of art, he discovered, as he started to do his own family history, that he is descended not from the Hardenbergh family, but from the Frelinghuysen family. You'll recall the Old Dutch Parsonage, and on my earlier introduction, the first minister was Johannes Frelinghuysen, and he had 2 children. And the collector is a descendant of one of those children, Eva Frelinghuysen. So they are, I guess, related way back. This guy didn't know that when he began collecting Hardenbergh. He only knew that he was like kind of a local artist who had done a lot of great work along the Jersey Shore. But yeah, so probably I would say, because the works were not really ever published and were not ever really exhibited in a museum, that probably plays into why. And even now, this is really the first time, at least to a New Jersey audience, it's been presented. And hopefully, maybe, I guess the idea is that this will now really open up understanding of Hardenbergh as, like we kind of brand him here, New Jersey's artist and ornithologist.
Alrighty, well, I don't see any other questions. So Cindy, would you like to take us out?
Paul, I just want to thank everyone who attended. I appreciate it. It is being recorded, so we will be having it up on the New Jersey State Library YouTube channel, and you can either rewatch it, because that was a lot of information, but it was really great. I like the interesting hike. I mean, when you go through a hike, if you really pay attention, you see a lot of different stuff, but it all relates, if nothing else, to you on that particular day as you're taking the hike, and I think that's what you really did with us here with this Hardenbergh hike through history. And we saw how New Jersey history was impacted, by this one person that so many of us didn't even know about. And obviously I didn't know about it. You knew about it from Morven, and then I saw the Morven thing, and then you contacted me about this. So, it's just interesting how it impacted different aspects of history and how that then impacts us. And so I just really appreciate it. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that everybody else did too. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Andrew, for helping with all the logistics. We hope you have a good day.
Take care. Stay well.
Take care. You too.